I helped smuggle a 7-foot creature out of the mountains before federal agents could take it. And I'd do it again. A younger ranger called in something dead near his cabin. Something he couldn't identify. When we arrived, we found a massive bipedal primate covered in reddish-brown hair. 2 bullet wounds, chest and skull. The face was disturbingly human. The hands had fingernails, not claws. Within 90 minutes of reporting it, federal agents were incoming by helicopter. Their instructions were clear. Touch nothing, say nothing. But I'd heard the rumors, bodies that disappear, witnesses silenced, evidence erased. So we made a choice. 6 hours until dawn. We dragged that 600-pound body 3 miles through darkness and hid it in a cave no one knows exists. The agents arrived to an empty scene. They knew we'd moved it. They just couldn't prove it. What happens when you find proof of something impossible and your own government wants it buried? I'm going to tell you. Something I should have said 8 years ago. My name is Dennis Halford, and for 23 years I was a ranger with the United States Forest Service, North Cascades District, up near the Canadian border in Washington State. If you know anything about that country, you know it's some of the most remote wilderness left in the lower 48. Hundreds of square miles of old-growth forest, granite peaks, glacial valleys, the kind of place where you can hike for 3 days and never cross another human footprint. I retired in 2019. Took my pension, moved down to Bellingham, tried to live a normal life. But there's something I kept locked away all this time. Something that ended my career and changed everything I thought I knew about the world. I'm only talking now because Rita Vaughn died last year, cancer. Sudden and brutal, and with her gone, I'm the last one left who will. Rita was my district supervisor back in September 2016. Good administrator, 15 years with the service, the kind of person who followed protocol down to the letter. She made a choice that month, or maybe she just looked the other way when Kevin Booth and I made ours. I'll never know for sure. She refused to discuss it afterward, even in private. When I saw her at the hospital in her final weeks, I thought maybe she'd finally say something, but she just squeezed my hand and told me to let it go. 2 days later, she was gone. Kevin won't talk either. He left the Forest Service in early 2017 and disappeared into private life somewhere in Montana. I've tried calling a few times over the years. He never picks up, so it's just me now. And I need to get this out before I take it to the grave, like Rita did. The North Cascades are different from other mountain ranges. They're older, deeper, less touched by human activity. We had outposts scattered throughout the district, small cabins where rangers would stay for weeks at a time, monitoring trails, checking on campsites, doing wildlife. Surveys. Most of the time, you'd go days without seeing another person. It was lonely work, but it attracted a certain kind of ranger. People who were comfortable with silence, with being truly alone in the wilderness. Kevin Booth was one of those rangers. Young guy, maybe late 20s, 3 or 4 years with the service. Quiet, competent, not the type to spook easily. He'd been stationed at the Copper Ridge Outpost since mid-August that year, a tiny cabin about 40 miles from the nearest road, accessible only by trail. Standard rotation was 3 weeks in, 1 week out. I was at the district office on September 23rd when his voice came through on the radio. It was late afternoon, maybe 4 o'clock, and I remember the light was already fading that time of year. The sun drops fast behind the peaks. His transmission was broken, full of static, but I could hear the strain in his voice immediately. "Base, this is Booth at Copper Ridge. I need someone to come out. Here, I found something." I was the duty officer that day. I keyed the mic. "Copy, Booth. What's your situation?" Long pause. More static. Then, "There's something dead near my location. Something big. I don't know what to write in the log." That got my attention. Kevin wasn't the type to get rattled by a dead animal. We dealt with carcasses all the time. Elk, black bears, the occasional mountain goat. "Can you describe it?" I asked. Another pause. "You need to see this, Dennis." "I can't." His voice cracked slightly. "Just come out here, please." Rita Vaughn was standing in the doorway of her office, listening. She caught my eye and nodded once. We both knew something was wrong. Kevin's voice had that quality you learn to recognize after enough years in the field, the sound of someone who's just seen something their brain can't quite process. "Copy that," I said. "We're coming to you. What are your coordinates?" He gave me a location about 2 miles northeast of his cabin, near a rock formation we called the Overhang. I told him to stay put, secure the area if he could, and wait for us. Rita was already pulling on her jacket. We packed light standard field gear, first aid kit, evidence bags in case it was a poaching scene. The hike to Copper Ridge was just under 8 miles from the nearest trailhead, maybe 2.5 hours at a steady pace. We figured we'd reach Kevin by dusk, assess the situation, and camp at his cabin if we needed to stay overnight. I remember Rita locked the office door behind us and said, "Probably just a bear, maybe shot by hunters." I nodded, but neither of us believed it. The trailhead was empty when we arrived, which wasn't unusual for late September. Tourist season was over, and the serious backpackers had mostly cleared out before the weather turned. We signed in at the Ranger Box standard protocol, even for staff, and started up the trail just after 5 p.m. The first mile was easy, switchbacks through second-growth Douglas fir and western hemlock. Rita set the pace, steady and efficient. She was 15 years older than me, mid-50s, but she could still move through the backcountry without much trouble. We didn't talk much. Both of us were thinking about Kevin's voice on that radio, the way it had wavered when he said he didn't know what to write in the log. After 23 years with the Forest Service, you develop certain instincts. You learn to read people, to sense when something's legitimately wrong versus when someone's just spooked by shadows or unfamiliar sounds. Kevin wasn't the panicking type. I'd worked with him on a search and recovery operation the previous summer, a lost hiker up near Cascade Pass, and he'd been calm, methodical, exactly the kind of ranger you want in a crisis. For him to sound that shaken meant we were walking into something unusual. The trail climbed steadily, crossing a creek swollen with early snowmelt from the high ridges. It was unseasonably cold that week, temperatures dropping into the low 30s at night, and there was already a dusting of fresh snow on the peaks above 8,000 feet. The air had that sharp, clean smell you only get in the mountains before winter locks everything down. Rita stopped at the creek crossing to refill her water bottle. "You ever work with Booth before?" she asked. "Once. Last year, SAR op. He was solid." She nodded, filtering water through her pump. "He's been up at Copper Ridge for 5 weeks straight. Requested an extension on his rotation. I hadn't known that. Standard was 3 weeks, sometimes 4 if staffing was tight. 5 weeks alone in a backcountry cabin was pushing it, even for someone comfortable with isolation." He say, "Why?" Just said he liked the quiet. Rita capped her bottle and stood, shouldering her pack. I approved it. Probably shouldn't have. We kept moving. The trail narrowed as we gained elevation, winding through old-growth forest where the trees were massive, some of them 4-5 feet in diameter, centuries old. The light was fading fast now, filtering down through the canopy in thin gray shafts. I could hear the distant call of a varied thrush, that lonely descending whistle that always sounds like something lost. Around mile 5, Rita asked the question I'd been avoiding. "What do you think he found?" "Don't know. Bear, probably. Maybe someone gut-shot an elk and it wandered off to die. He'd recognize a bear, yeah. Or an elk, yeah." We climbed in silence for another 20 minutes. The forest was changing now, thinning out as we approached the subalpine zone. More light reached the ground, but it wasn't comforting, just exposed everything in flat, colorless detail. The temperature had dropped noticeably. I could see my breath. Rita stopped suddenly, holding up one hand. I froze, listening. Nothing. Just wind moving through the trees, that constant whisper you get at higher elevations. Thought I heard. "Something," she said quietly. We waited. Still nothing. Rita shook her head and kept walking. By the time we reached the turnoff for Copper Ridge, it was nearly full dark. We switched on our headlamps, the beams cutting white tunnels through the trees. I could see the cabin about a quarter mile ahead, a dark shape against the darker forest, and smoke rising from the chimney. Kevin was waiting on the trail, maybe 50 yards from the cabin. My headlamp caught him, and he raised one hand to shield his eyes. Even from a distance, I could see he looked wrong, his posture too rigid, his face too pale in the artificial light. Rita reached him first. "Booth, you all right?" He nodded, but it wasn't convincing. Up close, I could see his hands were shaking slightly, and there was something in his eyes I didn't like. That flat, 1,000-yard stare you sometimes see in people who've just witnessed something traumatic. "It's about 1.5 miles from here," he said. His voice was steadier than It had been on the radio, but barely. "Northeast, near the overhang. I can take you there now, or we can wait until first light." Rita glanced at me. I checked my watch, almost 7:30. We'd been hiking for 2.5 hours, and we were all tired. But I could see Rita doing the same calculation I was. If this was a crime scene, every hour mattered. "We'll go now," Rita said. "Lead the way." Kevin turned without another word and started up the trail. I fell in behind Rita, and we followed him into the darkness, our headlamps bouncing with each step. The forest pressed in on all sides, dense and silent in that way that only mountain wilderness can be. Not just quiet, silent. No insects, no birds, no rustling in the underbrush. Just the sound of our boots on dirt and our breathing, and the occasional crack of a branch underfoot. After about 20 minutes, Kevin slowed. "It's just ahead," he said. "Maybe another 100 yards. Then the smell hit us. I've smelled death before. You can't work wilderness patrol for 2 decades without encountering your share of carcasses, deer rotting in creek beds, elk killed by cougars and left to bloat in the sun, even a few human remains from hikers who went off-trail and never came back. Each species has its own signature. The sweet-sour reek of decomposing flesh, the ammonia bite of decay, the underlying mineral tang of blood going bad. This was different. It hit us like a wall, even at 100 yards, musky and sour, and wrong in a way I couldn't immediately place. Not quite mammal, not quite primate, but somewhere in between. The smell had weight to it, substance. Rita actually stopped walking and put her hand over her nose and mouth. "Jesus," she said, her voice muffled. Kevin didn't say anything. He just kept walking, and after a moment, we followed. The trail was barely visible now, just a faint depression through the undergrowth. We were off the maintained paths, picking our way through salal and Oregon grape, the branches catching at our pant legs. Then Kevin stopped and pointed. "There." My headlamp swept across crushed ferns, disturbed soil, and finally landed on the rock overhang he'd mentioned on the radio. It was a natural formation, maybe 15 feet high, with a shallow cave underneath where the limestone had eroded over millennia. The opening was partly obscured by Douglas fir saplings and dense brush, and underneath, partially concealed in shadow, was something large. I moved closer, my beam playing across reddish-brown fur matted with dried blood and forest debris. The body was on its side, one arm, and it was an arm. I could see that immediately flung out across the dirt. The hand was easily twice the size of my own, fingers thick and calloused, nails dark and cracked, but unmistakably nails, not claws. Rita was beside me now, her own headlamp adding to the illumination. Neither of us spoke. We just stood there, trying to make sense of what we were seeing. It was massive. Even lying down, I could tell it was well over 7 feet tall, probably closer to 7.5. The shoulders were impossibly broad, the chest deep and heavily muscled even in death. The legs were shorter proportionally, bent at the knees. The feet, my God, the feet had to be 18, maybe 20 inches long, but it was the face that made my mouth go dry. I've looked at a lot of bears over the years. Black bears, grizzlies, even a few that were shot and brought in by hunters. You can always tell it's a bear. The snout is elongated, the eyes are set differently. The skull structure is distinctly ursine no matter how you dress it up. This wasn't a bear. The face was flat, pushed in, with a heavy brow ridge that cast deep shadows in our headlamp beams. The nose was broad and flattened, almost human in its placement. The jaw was massive, protruding slightly, but the underlying bone structure, the cheekbones, the eye sockets, the general architecture was unmistakably hominid. The eyes were half open, clouded over in death, but even now they had an intelligence to them that made something primitive in my brain start screaming. "We need to call this in right now," Rita whispered. I nodded, but I couldn't look away. There were 2 wounds, both obvious even under the matted fur. One in the chest, left side, probably a lung shot. The other through the skull, just above the right eye, an execution shot, something you do to make sure the target stays down. Kevin spoke from behind us, his voice flat. "I heard the shots last night. 2 of them, maybe 15 minutes apart. Distant, probably a mile or more east. I thought it was hunters, someone taking an illegal night shot at an elk. Didn't think much of it until this morning when I found the drag marks." "Drag marks?" Rita's headlamp swung toward him. "Leading here from the east. Something pulled it, or it pulled itself. Blood trail runs about 200 yards before it stops at that tree line." He pointed into the darkness beyond our lights. I moved closer, crouching beside the body. The smell was overwhelming now, filling my sinuses, coating the back of my throat. I could see details I'd missed from farther away. Old scars on the forearms, calluses on the palms, a pattern of wear on the fingertips that suggested regular use of the hands for gripping, climbing, manipulating objects. The hair was thick and coarse, about 3 inches long over most of the body, shorter on the face and hands. Reddish-brown, like Kevin had said, with hints of gray around the muzzle and temples. There was no collar, no identification. No sign whatsoever that this thing had ever been in captivity or under human control. It had lived in the wild, moved through this forest, probably for decades, completely unknown and undocumented. And someone had shot it. Rita had her radio out, stepping away from the body to get better reception. I heard her key, the mic, heard the squelch of static, then her voice, carefully. Controlled. Base, this is Vaughn at Copper Ridge. We have a situation that requires immediate escalation. I need you to contact. She paused. Contact District HQ. Tell them we have an unknown large mammal, deceased, possible homicide scene. We need federal wildlife enforcement and possibly DOI. Coordinates to follow. There was a long pause on the other end. Then a male voice, tinny through the speaker. Copy that. Can you clarify the species? Rita looked at me, then at the body, then back at her radio. Negative. Species unknown. Just send whoever handles this kind of thing. She gave the coordinates, signed off, and stood there with the radio in her hand, staring at nothing. Kevin was sitting on a fallen log now, his head in his hands. I stayed crouched beside the body, my headlamp illuminating that face, those hands, trying to reconcile 23 years of rational wilderness management with what was lying dead in front of me. It took 90 minutes for HQ to call back. Rita's radio crackled at 9:15. We'd been waiting in near silence, the three of us standing or sitting in a rough perimeter around the body, our headlamps creating overlapping pools of light that barely pushed back the darkness. The temperature had dropped into the low 30s. I could see frost starting to form on the exposed surfaces of the rock overhang. Vaughn, this is District Command. The voice was clipped, official. Not the usual night dispatcher. Someone higher up the chain. Rita keyed her mic. Go ahead. Secure the immediate area. Do not touch, move, or further document the specimen. Federal assets are en route and will arrive at first light via helicopter. You are to maintain position until they arrive. Acknowledge. The way he said specimen made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. Copy that, Rita said. What's our ETA on the helicopter? Approximately 0630 hours, weather permitting. A pause. This is now a federal matter under 6. Wildlife enforcement protocols. You are not to discuss this incident via radio or any other means. Acknowledge. Rita's jaw tightened. Acknowledged. Command out. The radio went dead. Rita clipped it back to her belt and looked at me. In the harsh LED light of our headlamps, her face looked 10 years older than it had that afternoon. Wildlife enforcement protocols, Kevin said from his log. Is that even a real thing? I've never heard that phrase before, Rita admitted. Not in 15 years. I stood up, my knees cracking. They're not sending Park Service. They're not sending local law enforcement. They're sending federal agents by helicopter with protocols already in place. Which means they know what this is, Kevin said quietly. Nobody responded to that. The tone from District Command hadn't been confusion or disbelief. It had been procedure. Lock it down, secure the scene, wait for the specialists. Like they'd done this before. Rita pulled crime scene tape from her pack. We all carried it for poaching scenes and started marking off a perimeter around the overhang. Kevin and I helped, stringing the yellow plastic between trees, creating a roughly circular boundary, maybe 30 feet in diameter. While we worked, I kept stealing glances at the body. My ranger training was kicking in, cataloging details. Estimated time of death, 12 to 18 hours, based on the rigor and the temperature. Cause of death, trauma from the chest wound, with the head shot as a follow-up. The blood pool underneath was extensive, but mostly dried, suggesting it had bled out where it lay. The hands kept drawing my attention. The proportions were wrong for a human. The fingers were thicker, the palm broader, but the basic structure was identical. 4 fingers, one opposable thumb. Fingernails, not claws. calluses in places that suggested grip strength and regular use. I thought about all the stories I'd heard over the years. The jokes in the break room about Bigfoot sightings, the occasional report from hikers claiming they'd seen something that wasn't quite right. We'd always dismissed them, filed them under wildlife misidentification. Park Service had form letters for that kind of thing. But somewhere, someone had forms for this too. Wildlife enforcement protocols, federal assets, a helicopter at dawn. Dennis. Rita's voice pulled me back. She was setting up a tarp shelter near the body, not over it, but nearby, somewhere we could sit and wait out of the weather. Help me with this. We strung the tarp between two trees and built a small fire. The flames pushed back the darkness and gave us something to focus on besides the body lying 15 feet away. Nobody wanted to eat, but we forced down energy bars and drank water. Rita checked her radio every few minutes, but the frequencies stayed silent. Around 11, Kevin spoke up. I should tell you something. Rita and I both looked at him. He was staring into the fire, his face hollowed out by shadow. When I found it this morning, it wasn't completely dead yet. My stomach dropped. What? It was breathing. Shallow, barely there, but breathing. I watched it for maybe 5 minutes before it stopped. He paused. Its eyes were open. It looked at me. Not like an animal looks at you, it looked at me. Like it knew I was there. Like it was aware. Rita's hand had gone to her mouth. Jesus Christ, Kevin. I didn't know what to do. I thought about trying to help it, but... He gestured helplessly at the body. What was I supposed to do? Call for a medevac? His voice cracked slightly. So I just watched it die, and then I called you. We sat in silence. The fire popped, sending up sparks. Finally, Rita spoke. When those agents arrive tomorrow, we don't mention that part. You found it dead. That's the story. Kevin nodded slowly. I looked back at the body, at that face, those hands. Somewhere out in the darkness, someone had shot this thing and left it to bleed out alone. And tomorrow, federal agents were going to make it disappear. Rita and Kevin were both looking at me now. I could see the same thought forming in all our minds. If we don't move this tonight, I said quietly, we'll never see it again. Kevin stared at me for a long moment, then nodded slowly. Rita's expression was harder to read in the firelight, part fear, part calculation, part something else I couldn't identify. You're talking about evidence tampering, she said. Federal jurisdiction. This isn't a poaching case we can massage in the reports. I'm talking about the truth disappearing into some warehouse we'll never hear about again. I kept my voice low, even though there was no one to hear us for miles. You heard that transmission. They have protocols. They've done this before. Rita stood and walked to the edge of our tarp shelter, looking out at the body. I've spent 15 years following the rules, Dennis. Doing everything by the book. I know, if we do this, our careers are over. All three of us. Probably. She was quiet for what felt like a full minute. Then, where would we even move it? That thing has to weigh 500-600 pounds. I'd been thinking about that since the words left my mouth. There's a cave system about 3 miles northeast of here. Old logging road runs within half a mile of it, overgrown now, hasn't been used in 20 years. I found it my second season, back in '95, never reported it because it was outside my patrol zone. 3 miles, Kevin said. In the dark. With that. He gestured toward the body. We have maybe 8 hours before that helicopter arrives. It's doable if we start now. Rita turned back to face us. And then what? They arrive, find the scene empty, and just leave? We stage it. Blood trail, hair samples, some tissue, make it look like something dragged it off. Bear, cougar, something plausible. They'll know it's bullshit, but they can't prove anything. They'll reassign, question us, maybe worse. Maybe, I stood up, meeting her eyes, but at least we'll know what we saw. At least this thing won't just vanish like it never existed. Kevin was on his feet now too. I'm in. Whatever happens, I can't. He looked at the body. I watched it die. I can't watch it disappear too. Rita stood there, arms crossed, jaw tight. I could see the war happening behind her eyes, every regulation she'd ever followed, every protocol she'd enforced, weighed against what was lying dead under that rock overhang. Finally, she closed her eyes and exhaled slowly. If we do this, we do it smart. No radio communication, no documentation, nothing that ties us to moving it. And Rita Vaughn falls asleep in the cabin at midnight after a long hike and doesn't wake up until dawn. Understood. It took me a second to process what she was saying. She was giving us permission while building herself plausible deniability. Kevin caught on at the same time I did. Understood. She nodded once, then pulled her pack over her shoulder. I'm going back to the cabin. I'm exhausted. You two should get some sleep too. Long day tomorrow when those agents arrive. She looked at both of us meaningfully. I'll see you at first light. Then she was gone, her headlamp bobbing through the trees back toward Kevin's cabin. Kevin and I stood in silence until her light disappeared completely. So we're really doing this, he said. We're really doing this. We had maybe an hour before Rita would be asleep and we could start. We spent it planning, talking through logistics in low voices. Kevin's cabin had tarps, rope, his emergency sled that he used for supply hauls. We'd need to wrap the body, secure it, drag it to the old logging road. The cave was another half-mile from there, through rough terrain, but manageable if we took our time. The biggest risk was the weight. Neither of us had ever moved something that size before. We'd have to work slowly, carefully, stopping every 100 yards to rest and listen for any sign of Rita or, God forbid, an early arrival by the federal agents. I checked my watch. 11:45. We gave Rita 15 more minutes, then Kevin and I walked back to the cabin. It was dark inside except for the dying glow of embers in the wood stove. I could hear her breathing, slow and steady, from the small sleeping area in the back. Kevin gathered supplies in silence, 2 heavy tarps, 50 feet of paracord, the aluminum supply sled that was maybe 4 feet long and 2 feet wide. Not ideal, but it would have to work. I grabbed extra batteries for our headlamps and a small first aid kit, though I wasn't sure what I thought we'd need it for. We hauled everything back to the site, moving as quietly as we could through the darkness. The body was still there, unchanged. That smell still overwhelming, even in the cold air. I'd been half afraid it would be gone, that this whole thing was some kind of exhaustion-induced hallucination. But it was real, solid, dead. Kevin looked at me. Last chance to back out. I thought about Rita's words. Our careers were over either way, whether we moved it or not, whether those agents found it or didn't. At least this way, we'd have some control over what happened next. Let's get to work, I said. We started wrapping the body at 12:30 a.m. We had maybe 6 hours until dawn. The first challenge was just getting the tarps underneath the body. We had to roll it slightly, and the moment I put my hands on it on that coarse, matted fur, something in my brain rebelled. This wasn't an animal. The muscle structure was wrong, the proportions were wrong. Everything about it screamed hominid, even through the thick hair covering. On 3, Kevin whispered. 1, 2, 3. We heaved, and the body shifted maybe 6 inches. It was staggeringly heavy. Dead weight, in the most literal sense. The smell intensified as we moved it, that musky, sour odor mixing with the iron tang of dried blood. I had to stop and breathe through my mouth to keep from gagging. It took us 20 minutes just to get the first tarp positioned underneath. Then we rolled it back the other direction to thread the second tarp through. Kevin was shaking from cold or adrenaline or both. I couldn't tell. My own hands weren't steady. Once we had it wrapped, we used the paracord to secure the bundle, creating a rough harness we could attach to the sled. The sled itself was absurdly inadequate, designed for hauling camping gear, not a 600-pound corpse, but it was all we had. We positioned it at the head end and used more cord to lash the wrapped body to the aluminum frame. I checked my watch. 1:15 a.m. We'd burned 45 minutes just on prep work. Ready? Kevin asked. I nodded, and we both gripped the front of the sled. On a count of 3, we pulled. The sled moved maybe 3 feet before the runners caught on a root. We adjusted, pulled again, another few feet. The body dragged heavily behind us, the tarp scraping against rocks and dirt, making far too much noise in the silent forest. We settled into a brutal rhythm. Pull for 20 or 30 feet, stop to catch our breath and listen, pull again. My back was screaming within the first 100 yards. Kevin's face was red with exertion, his breathing harsh and ragged. The temperature had dropped further, probably mid-20s now, and despite the physical work, I could feel the cold seeping into my fingers and toes. The terrain didn't help. We were heading northeast, away from the maintained trails, through dense underbrush and deadfall that seemed designed to snag the sled at every opportunity. Twice, the body nearly rolled off and we had to stop and resecure the lashing. My headlamp battery died around 2 a.m., and I had to stop and swap it out with fumbling, numb fingers. We didn't talk except for brief, necessary communication. Branch left. Stop. Hold on. Every sound felt. Amplified in the darkness, the scrape of the sled, our labored breathing, the occasional crack of a twig underfoot. I kept expecting to hear Rita's voice behind us, or worse, the distant sound of a helicopter arriving early. Around 2:30, we reached the old logging road. It was barely recognizable as a road anymore, just a slight depression through the forest where the trees grew a bit sparser, overgrown with saplings and ferns. But the ground was more level, and for the first time we could actually pull the sled without it catching every few feet. We made better time for maybe 20 minutes. Then Kevin stopped suddenly, holding up one hand. Nothing. After a full minute, Kevin shook his head and we kept moving. But now I was hearing things too. Phantom sounds in the darkness, branches moving, footsteps that might have been our own echoes, a low rumble that could have been distant thunder or something else entirely. The exhaustion was playing tricks on my mind, making me see shapes in the shadows that disappeared when I looked directly at them. The cave entrance was harder to find than I remembered. We'd been dragging the body for over 2 hours when I finally recognized the limestone ridge I was looking for, a pale outcropping barely visible in our headlamp beams. The entrance was concealed behind a screen of boulders and scrub pine, just as I remembered, but getting the sled through required dismantling part of our harness and manhandling the body over rough ground. Kevin slipped on loose scree and went down hard on one knee. I heard him curse under his breath, but he was back up immediately, grabbing his end of the tarp. The cave mouth was narrow, maybe 4 feet wide, but it opened up quickly into a larger chamber. I'd explored it years ago with another ranger, found it went back maybe 50 feet before narrowing into passages too small to navigate. The floor was dry, covered in sand and small rocks, and the air inside was noticeably warmer than outside. We dragged the body all the way to the back of the main chamber and stopped. Both of us were beyond exhausted, muscles trembling, lungs burning from the cold air and exertion. Kevin slumped against the cave wall. Now what? I pulled out my multi-tool and knelt beside the wrapped body. There was one more thing I needed to do, something I'd been thinking about since we started this insane plan. Insurance, I said, and began unwrapping the tarp around the head. Kevin watched as I peeled back the tarp, exposing that face again in the harsh LED light. Even in death, even after hours of being moved and jostled, there was something disturbingly human about the features. The heavy brow cast deep shadows. The lips were slightly parted, revealing teeth that were flat and worn like a human's, not the sharp canines of a predator. "What are you doing?" Kevin asked. I didn't answer immediately. I was examining the jaw, looking for the right tooth, something large enough to be significant, small enough to extract without specialized tools. The molars in the back were massive, easily twice the size of a human's. I selected one on the lower left side, positioned my multi-tool's pliers, and pulled. It took more force than I expected. The tooth was seated deep, and I had to brace myself against the cave wall and use my full body weight. Finally, with a wet cracking sound that made my stomach turn, it came free. A molar, roughly the size of my thumb, stained with blood at the root. Jesus, Dennis. I wrapped it in my bandana and stuffed it into my inside jacket pocket, zipping the pocket closed. If this thing disappears, at least we'll have proof it existed. DNA, structural evidence, something. Kevin nodded slowly. He understood. In for a penny, in for a pound. We rewrapped the body and concealed it as best we could in the deepest part of the stark chamber, piling loose rocks and debris around it. It wouldn't fool anyone who came looking, but from the cave entrance, it was effectively invisible in the shadows. Then we began the process of covering our tracks. We used pine branches to sweep away the drag marks on the cave floor, scattered sand and small rocks to make the surface look undisturbed. Outside, we spent another hour doing the same, erasing sled marks, replacing disturbed vegetation, doing everything we could to make it look like no one had been through here recently. By the time we started back toward the original site, it was nearly 4:30 a.m. We had maybe 2 hours until dawn. Less until the helicopter arrived. Both of us were running on pure adrenaline now, exhaustion so deep it felt like moving through water. The hike back took less time without the body, but we were moving more carefully now, hyper-aware that we were returning to a scene where Rita would supposedly be waking up soon. We needed to look like we'd been there all night, standing watch like we'd been ordered. Kevin had the presence of mind to fill a water bottle at a creek crossing. "We're gonna look like shit either way," he said. "Might as well look like we stayed awake all night in the cold." He was right. When I caught a glimpse of my reflection in the dark water, I barely recognized myself. Face haggard, eyes sunken, clothes filthy with dirt and pine needles. We both looked exactly like we'd been through hell. We reached the original site just after 5 a.m. The crime scene tape was still in place, fluttering slightly in the pre-dawn breeze. The fire had burned down to ash. We rebuilt it, more for appearance than warmth, and then came the delicate part. We had to stage the scene. Working quickly, I used my knife to scrape dried blood from the ground where the body had lain and smeared it in a rough trail leading east toward the tree line. Not too obvious, but enough to suggest something had dragged the carcass. Away. Kevin pulled hair samples we'd saved from the wrapping process and scattered them along the trail. I made several partial handprints in the soft earth using my gloved hands, pressing them deep and then distorting them to look like animal tracks. Then I pulled out my plaster casting kit, the one I'd brought legitimately, thinking we might need it for evidence. I made 3 casts of prints I'd photographed earlier before we moved the body. Clear, detailed impressions of those massive 5-toed feet. Once the plaster set, I carefully extracted them and set them aside to dry by the rebuilt fire. The sky was starting to lighten in the east. Maybe 45 minutes until the helicopter could safely land. Kevin was arranging the tarp shelter to look like we'd spent the night there, sleeping bags laid out but not slept in. Our packs positioned naturally. He caught my eye. "You think this will work?" "No idea, but it's better than nothing." We heard footsteps on the trail and both tensed. Then Rita's voice called out, "Booth? Halford?" She emerged from the tree line, headlamp still on, though dawn was breaking. She looked exactly like someone who'd just woken up after a few hours of sleep, alert but tired, her hair disheveled. She played the part perfectly. "Status?" she asked, looking around the site. "Gone," Kevin said, his voice flat. "Something dragged it off, maybe an hour ago." We heard movement in the brush, but couldn't see what it was in the dark. Rita walked to the edge of the scene, examining the blood trail, the scattered hair, the disturbed earth. Her face betrayed nothing. "You're sure it was an animal?" "Had to be," I said. Nothing else could move something that size. She stared at the trail leading into the darkness for a long moment. Then she pulled out her radio and keyed it. "District Command, this is Vaughn. We have a situation. The specimen is gone. Repeat, specimen is no longer at the site." The radio stayed silent for almost a full souls. "Then say again, Vaughn. Confirm specimen status." Rita's voice didn't waver. "Specimen appears to have been removed from the site by predator or scavenger activity. We have blood trail and physical evidence, but the body is gone." Another long pause. I could imagine the chaos this was causing on the other end. Calls being made, protocols being consulted. Someone very high up being woken with news they didn't want to hear. "Stand by," the voice finally said. We stood by. The sun was fully above the horizon now, pale morning light filtering through the trees. The temperature was rising, but not by much, still in the low 30s, frost sparkling on every surface. I kept my hands in my pockets, feeling the weight of that tooth wrapped in my bandana. At 6:20, we heard it, the distant thump of rotor blades growing louder. The helicopter came in from the south, a black Bell 206 with no visible markings. It circled once over the site, then moved to a clearing about a quarter-mile away where Kevin had told them they could land. 10 minutes later, 2 men appeared on the trail. They were both in their 40s, dressed in plain outdoor clothes that were somehow too clean, too new. One was tall and lean, with graying hair, cut military short. The other was broader, heavy-set, with a face that looked like it had forgotten how to smile decades ago. Both wore federal badges on lanyards, but the badges were turned backwards so we couldn't read the agency. "I'm Agent Garrett," the tall one said. No first name offered. "This is Agent Mills. You're Vaughn?" Rita nodded. "District Supervisor." "This is Halford and Booth, Rangers, who responded to the initial call." Garrett's eyes swept over us, taking in every detail. Our exhausted faces, our dirty clothes, the scene behind us. "Walk me through what happened." Rita gestured to Kevin, who explained finding the body yesterday morning, hearing the shots the night before, calling it in. His voice was steady, factual. He didn't mention watching it die. Didn't mention the way it had looked at him. I picked up the narrative, describing our arrival, what we'd found, securing the scene. I showed them the plaster casts I'd made, still sitting by the fire. Garrett examined them without comment, his face unreadable. "And then?" Mills asked. His voice was rough, like he gargled gravel. "We maintained position through the night, as ordered," Rita said. Approximately 0500, we heard sounds of movement in the brush to the east. By the time we could investigate, the specimen had been removed. "Removed?" Garrett repeated. "By what?" "Unknown. We couldn't see in the dark. Could have been a bear, cougar, possibly multiple animals." Garrett and Mills exchanged a glance I couldn't read. Then Garrett walked past us to examine the blood trail, the scattered hair, the disturbed ground where the body had been. Mills stayed with us, his eyes never leaving our faces. "That's a lot of blood," Garrett called. "Must have been a big specimen." "Over 7 feet," I said. "Estimated weight 500 to 600 pounds. And something just dragged it away." His tone was neutral, but there was an edge underneath it. "That's what the evidence suggests." Garrett crouched at the edge of the blood trail, examining it closely. He pulled out a small camera and took several photographs. Then he began collecting samples, hair, blood, soil, placing them in evidence bags with methodical precision. Mills moved to help him, and for the next 20 minutes they worked the scene like professionals who'd done this many times before. Finally, Garrett stood and walked back to us. "Where are your field notes?" Kevin produced his notebook. Garrett flipped through it, photographed several pages, then confiscated it entirely. "Official evidence," he said, offering no receipt. "We'll need your plaster casts as well," Mills added, gathering them before I could respond. "What about the blood trail?" Rita asked. "Are you going to follow it?" "That's not your concern," Garrett said. "This is federal jurisdiction now. You three are to return to your stations and file no reports regarding this incident. Is that clear? You're not even going to search for it?" Kevin's voice had an edge now. Garrett turned to him, and something cold flashed in his eyes. "Ranger Booth, I'm going to ask you a direct question, and I need a direct answer. Did anyone move or tamper with the specimen before it was removed by animal activity?" The silence stretched. Kevin's jaw was tight, but his voice stayed steady. "No, sir. You're sure about that?" "Yes, sir." Garrett held his gaze for another few seconds, then turned to me. "Ranger Halford?" The scene was secured as ordered. We touched nothing. He knew we were lying. I could see it in his face, in the way his eyes narrowed slightly, but he couldn't prove it. The helicopter lifted off 20 minutes later, taking Garrett, Mills, and all our evidence with it. We stood in silence as the sound faded, leaving only wind in the trees and the quiet pop of our dying fire. Rita spoke first. "Back to the cabin. We debriefed there, not here." The hike took 30 minutes. None of us said a word. Inside Kevin's cabin, Rita locked the door and closed the curtains. Even though we were 40 miles from the nearest human, she sat at the small table and looked at both of us. "That went as well as it could have," she said quietly. "They suspect, but they can't prove anything." "They're not even going to search," Kevin said, his voice tight with anger. "They don't care that it's out there somewhere. They just want it gone." "That's exactly what they want," I said. "Evidence disappears, the problem disappears." Rita rubbed her eyes. She looked more exhausted than I'd ever seen her. "What's done is done. Now we wait and see what comes next." What came next arrived 12 days later. I was at the district office when I found the transfer notice on my desk. Effective immediately, I was being reassigned to a desk position in the Wenatchee office, 3 hours south. Administrative necessity, no explanation, no appeal process. I called Rita. "Did you get one?" "No." Her voice was careful, controlled. "Not yet. They're splitting us up. Looks that way." I wanted to ask if she regretted it, if she thought we'd made the right choice. But phones weren't secure, and we both knew it. "I'll be in touch," I said, and hung up. Kevin called me 2 days later. He didn't have a transfer notice. He had something worse, a performance review, citing judgment concerns and difficulty with high-stress situations. It wasn't quite a termination, but the writing was on the wall. "I'm done, Dennis," he said. "I can't do this anymore. I can't pretend that night didn't happen, can't file reports that don't mention any of it, can't look at my supervisor without wondering if they know. So what are you going to do?" "I'm resigning. End of the month. I've got a friend in Missoula who runs an outdoor gear shop says he can give me work." "Kevin, don't." This was my choice too. He was quiet for a moment. I just need to be somewhere I don't have to lie every day. He was gone by October 15th. I started my new desk job on October 20th. Rita stayed at her post, and for the next few months we maintained minimal contact. A brief email here and there, nothing substantive. I kept waiting for federal agents to show up at my door, for an investigation to begin, for consequences. They never came. Instead, there was just silence, no follow-up questions, no requests for additional statements, no acknowledgement that September 23rd had ever happened. I checked the incident database whenever I could, nothing. No report filed, no case number assigned. It was like that night had been erased from official record. In November, I drove back to the North Cascades on my day off. I told myself I was just visiting, checking on a place I'd worked for 2 decades, but really, I needed to know if the body was still there. I hiked to the cave alone. It took me longer than it had that night. I was exhausted from a week of sitting at a desk, and I was moving carefully, checking behind me every few minutes to make sure I wasn't followed. The cave entrance was undisturbed. I climbed inside, turned on my flashlight, and walked to the back chamber. Empty. The rocks we'd piled were scattered. The depression where we'd left the body was still visible, but everything else was gone. No body, no tarps, no trace that anything had been there. I stood in the darkness, my flashlight beam playing over empty stone, and felt something cold settle in my chest. Someone had found it, moved it. The question was who and whether it was federal agents or someone else entirely. I drove back to Wenatchee that night, the tooth still wrapped in my bandana, locked in my glove compartment. It was the only proof I had left that any of it had been real. 2 months later, I got a phone call from a number I didn't recognize. The voice on the other end was male, educated, careful. "Mr. Halford, I understand you may have information relevant to my research." I almost hung up. Every instinct screamed that this was a set-up federal agents testing me, seeing if I'd admit to anything. But something in the voice stopped me. It wasn't official. It was cautious, almost nervous. "Who is this?" "My name isn't important. What's important is that I know what you found in September, and I know you moved it." My hand tightened on the phone. "I don't know what you're talking about. Mr. Halford, please. I'm not with any government agency. I'm a private researcher. I've been tracking incidents like yours for 15 years. A pause. "The cave is empty now, because I had it moved. With your help, whether you knew it or not." "That's impossible. I never contacted anyone." "You didn't have to. Satellite imagery shows 3 heat signatures, moving from the original site to a limestone formation 3 miles northeast at approximately 0200 hours on September 24th. 2 signatures returned. 1 remained. I felt the blood drain from my face. They'd been watching. The whole time, someone had been watching from above. "What do you want?" My voice came out hoarse. "I want to preserve what you risked everything to protect. The specimen is safe. It's being studied by people who understand its significance. But I need to know, did you keep anything? Any physical evidence?" I thought about the tooth, still in my glove box. "Why would I tell you that?" "Because in 3 years, maybe 5, the DNA analysis will be complete, and when it is, someone needs to be able to corroborate the findings. Someone credible, with detailed knowledge of the recovery." He paused. "You did the right thing, Mr. Halford. Now let me help you finish it." "I need time to think." "Of course. I'll call again in 1 week. And Mr. Halford, don't discuss this conversation with anyone. Not your former colleagues, not your family. The people who arrived in that helicopter are still looking. They don't forget, and they don't forgive." The line went dead. I sat in my apartment for hours after that call, staring at nothing. Part of me wanted to believe him, wanted to think the body was somewhere safe, being studied, that our choice that night had actually meant something. But another part wondered if I'd just been played, if the tooth was the last piece they needed and I'd just confirmed I had it. I never called Kevin, never told Rita. The man called back a week later, and I told him I had nothing. He thanked me politely and hung up. I never heard from him again. The years that followed were strange. I kept working my desk job, processing permits and filing reports, watching my career wind down into bureaucratic irrelevance. I was 48 when it happened. I'd planned to work until at least 60. Instead, I took early retirement in 2019 at 51, my pension reduced but adequate. Rita and I maintained occasional contact, brief emails, a phone call every few months. We never discussed that night directly, but it was always there between us, the shared weight of what we'd done and what we'd seen. She seemed to age faster after 2016, the job taking more out of her than it used to. When she was diagnosed with pancreatic cancer in early 2023, she only told me 2 weeks before she died. I drove up to Mount Vernon for her memorial service. It was small, some Forest Service colleagues, a few family members, no one from her personal life that I recognized. The district supervisor gave a brief speech about her years of dedicated service, her commitment to protocol and procedure. I almost laughed at that. Rita Vaughn had broken every protocol that mattered in a single night, and no one in that room, except me, would ever know. Afterward, I stood by her grave and thought about what Kevin had said years ago. I can't pretend that night didn't happen. Rita had pretended. She'd gone back to work, followed the rules, lived out her career as if September 23rd had been just another shift. Maybe that was courage. Maybe it was denial. I still don't know. What I do know is that with Rita gone, I'm the only one left who will talk. Kevin is somewhere in Montana, unreachable and unwilling. The federal agents are still out there, still enforcing their protocols and making inconvenient evidence disappear. And somewhere, maybe in a lab, maybe in another warehouse, the body we moved that night either yielded its secrets or became just another buried file. I kept the tooth all these years, gave it to someone I trust, someone who might be able to get it analyzed if the moment ever comes. I won't say who. But it's out there, that single molar, the only piece of physical proof that what we saw was real. Rita died believing we did the right thing. I have to believe that's true, because if that night in the North Cascades was just the beginning of a longer cover-up, if we played right into someone's hands, then her silence and Kevin's exile and my exile to a desk were all for nothing. But I don't think they were. I think we saved something that mattered, even if I'll never know what became of it. And that has to be enough. The question everyone will ask is the simplest one. What was it? I've had 8 years to think about this. 8 years to research, to consult field guides and academic texts, to lurk in online forums where people discuss cryptids and unknown primates. I've read every scientific paper I could find on hominid evolution, great ape anatomy, and reports of anomalous primate sightings across North America. I've approached this like I would any wildlife identification, methodically, systematically, ruling out known species before considering unknown ones. So let me walk you through it. First possibility, it was a bear. Black bears can stand upright, and in certain conditions they might appear humanoid at a distance. This is the explanation the Park Service uses for 90% of Bigfoot sightings, and it's usually correct. But I was 3 feet away from that body. I put my hands on it. A bear has a pronounced snout, a skull structure that's immediately recognizable as ursine. The teeth are designed for an omnivorous diet, sharp canines, specialized molars. The hands have claws, not fingernails. The proportions are all wrong, short legs relative to the body, a different hip structure, different shoulder placement. What we found had none of those characteristics. The face was flat, pushed in, with a skull architecture that was unmistakably primate. The teeth were flat and worn like a human's or a great ape's. The hands had fingernails, opposable thumbs, calluses that suggested regular manipulation of objects. The feet were plantigrade flat, 5-toed, designed for bipedal locomotion. It wasn't a bear. I'd stake my career on that statement, except my career is already gone. Second possibility, it was a hoax. Someone, in an elaborate costume or a constructed prop, placed there to fool us, or to create viral content, or for reasons I can't fathom. I've thought about this a lot. Modern special effects can create incredible things, realistic silicone skin, artificial hair, animatronic features, but this would have had to be the most sophisticated costume ever made, detailed enough to fool a ranger with 2 decades of wildlife experience examining it at close range. The muscle structure under the skin moved correctly. The rigor mortis was real. The wounds were real. I saw bone and tissue. The smell was real. That overwhelming organic decay that you can't fake. And then there's the weight. We moved that body. Kevin and I dragged it 3 miles through mountain wilderness. 600 pounds of dead weight doesn't lie. A costume, even an elaborate one, wouldn't have had that mass, that density. And why? Why would someone haul an enormously expensive prop into remote wilderness, shoot it twice, and leave it there? For what purpose? No cameras were found, no film crew, no social media post ever appeared claiming credit. It wasn't a hoax. Third possibility, it was a known primate species, somehow transported to the North Cascades. An escaped gorilla, maybe, or an orangutan from a private collection. The size is wrong. Male gorillas average 5.5 feet, maybe 6 feet tall. What we found was over 7 feet. The hair was wrong, reddish-brown, coarse, about 3 inches long. Gorillas have black hair, usually shorter. The facial structure was wrong, the brow ridge was more pronounced, the jaw more robust than any great ape I've seen in zoos or documentaries. And again, why? How does a captive great ape end up 40 miles into wilderness with no facility within 500 miles that houses such animals? How does it survive in a climate it's not adapted for? Why are there no reports of an escape, no frantic search by owners or authorities? It wasn't an escaped zoo animal. So what's left? I'll tell you what I think, and you can decide if I'm credible or if 8 years of carrying this secret has made me unstable. I think it was a Sasquatch, a Bigfoot, a relict hominid that science refuses to acknowledge because acknowledging it would overturn too many comfortable assumptions about what we know and don't know. I think it was a species, probably small in population, probably isolated to remote wilderness areas that has survived by being intelligent enough to avoid human contact. I think the evidence has been there for decades, maybe centuries. Tracks, vocalizations, structures, sightings that get dismissed as misidentification or hoaxes. I think federal agencies know about it. Those protocols Agent Garrett mentioned weren't created overnight. The helicopter response, the evidence confiscation, the career repercussions for everyone involved, that's institutional memory. That's a system that's been operating for years, maybe longer, designed specifically to suppress evidence and silence witnesses. I think we found one that was killed shot by someone who either didn't know what they were shooting at in the dark or knew exactly what they were shooting at and did it anyway. I think we saved it from disappearing into whatever black site program handles these recoveries. And I think somewhere, someone is studying that body right now. And the results will never see the light of day. That's what I believe. You don't have to believe it, but I was there. I saw it. I touched it. And I'm telling you, it was real. In the summer of 2018, 2 years after that September night, I drove back to the North Cascades. I told myself it was just nostalgia, a chance to revisit the place where I'd spent most of my adult life. But that was a lie. I needed to know if there was anything else out there. If that body had been alone, or if others existed in those mountains. I didn't tell anyone I was going. I took a week of vacation, packed my old ranger gear, and drove north from Bellingham on a Tuesday morning in late June. The weather was perfect, clear skies, temperatures in the 70s. The kind of mountain summer that makes you forget how brutal the winters are. I started at the Copper Ridge Trailhead, the same place Rita and I had begun that hike 2 years earlier. The ranger box was still there, weathered and covered in moss. I signed in out of habit, though I wasn't required to anymore. The trail looked exactly as I remembered, switchbacks through Douglas fir, the steady climb toward the subalpine zone. It took me 3 hours to reach Kevin's old cabin. There was a new ranger stationed there now, a young woman I didn't recognize. I waved as I passed, but didn't stop. I wasn't there for conversation. I hiked past the cabin, northeast, toward the rock overhang where we'd found the body. The area looked different in summer lush and green, the undergrowth thick with ferns and salal. But I found the spot easily enough. The overhang was unchanged, the limestone formation still weathered and ancient. The ground underneath showed no signs of what had happened there. 2 years of rain and snow and spring growth had erased everything. I stood there for a long time, remembering. The smell, the face, Kevin's voice saying it looked at me. Then I hiked to the cave. It was harder to find in daylight and summer growth than it had been that night. The boulders screening the entrance were covered in moss and small plants. But eventually I found it, squeezed through the narrow opening, and entered the main chamber. Empty, just as it had been in November 2016. I'd expected that, but I spent an hour searching anyway, looking for any trace we might have missed, a hair, a piece of tarp, anything that would prove I hadn't imagined the whole thing. I found nothing. I was about to leave when I decided to check the area around the cave entrance, see if there were any signs of recent activity. The ground outside was a mix of sand and small rocks, not great for tracks, but I walked a slow spiral outward anyway. That's when I found them. They were about 30 yards from the cave entrance, near a small creek that I'd crossed without looking down. The ground there was soft mud, and pressed into it were tracks. Fresh tracks, the edges were still sharp, the impressions deep and clear. 5-toed, bipedal, at least 18 inches long. I stood there staring, my heart hammering. The tracks were in a line, a clear walking pattern, heading upstream along the creek bank. 4 prints visible before they disappeared into rocky terrain. I pulled out my phone and took probably 50 photographs from every angle, including shots with my boot next to them for scale. Then I followed them. The trail was easy for the first quarter mile. The creek provided soft ground that held impressions well. The stride length was enormous, at least 4.5 feet between steps, suggesting something with much longer legs than a human. The prints were consistent in size and depth, the weight distribution showing a midfoot strike that's characteristic of barefoot bipedal walking. Then the terrain turned rocky, and I lost them. I spent another hour searching, working in a grid pattern, the way I'd been trained, looking for any sign of where the creature had gone. Nothing. It was like it had simply vanished into the stone. I hiked back to the creek and sat beside those 4 prints for a long time. They were real, physical, undeniable. Something massive and bipedal had walked along this creek recently, probably within the last few days, based on the sharpness of the impressions and the weather patterns. The implications were overwhelming. If there were fresh tracks 2 years after we'd moved the body, that meant others existed in this area, a population, however small. The one we'd found hadn't been alone. It had lived here, moved through this forest, maybe had family or a social group, and somewhere out in these mountains, they were still here. I thought about going to the new ranger at Kevin's cabin, showing her the photographs, filing a report, but I already knew how that would go. The same way it had gone in 2016, federal intervention, evidence confiscation, another black mark on my record, if I still had one, so I didn't report it. Instead, I took my photographs and hiked back out. I stopped at the trailhead and looked back up at the mountains, at the vast wilderness stretching toward Canada. Hundreds of square miles of old-growth forest, glacial valleys, terrain so remote that humans rarely penetrate it. Perfect habitat for something that doesn't want to be found. I drove home that evening with my phone full of track photos and a new certainty settling in my chest. The body we'd moved wasn't an anomaly or a lone survivor. There was a population up there, small and elusive and intelligent enough to avoid detection for generations. And they were still watching. After that trip in 2018, I started reaching out to people, carefully, quietly, through unofficial channels. I wasn't looking for believers or conspiracy theorists. I wanted credible witnesses, people with backgrounds similar to mine who might have seen something they couldn't explain and were told to keep quiet about it. It took months. I'd send careful emails to retired rangers I'd worked with over the years, phrasing things vaguely. Did you ever encounter anything unusual in your district? Anything that didn't make it into official reports? Most didn't respond. A few replied with polite confusion. But 3 people admitted they had stories they'd never told anyone, or had told once and been instructed to forget. The first was a former ranger named Tom Briggs, who'd worked the Gifford-Pinchot National Forest in southern Washington during the late 1992. We met for coffee in Olympia in October 2018. Tom was in his 60s, retired for 5 years, and he spent the first 20 minutes of our conversation talking about nothing: grandkids, fishing, the Seahawks. Then, when he was sure no one nearby was listening, he leaned forward. "Summer of 1998, he said quietly. "We got a call from a trail crew working near Dark Meadow. They'd found something in a ravine, said it looked like a bear, but wrong. I hiked out with my supervisor and a guy from Fish and Wildlife. What did you find? A body. Big, covered in dark brown hair, face all smashed up from the fall. Maybe it had been there a week. Hard to tell with the decomp. But the supervisor took one look and radioed District HQ. Within 3 hours, we had people in suits telling us it was a misidentified bear and we needed to clear out. Did you see it up close?" Tom nodded slowly. "Close enough. The hands were wrong for a bear, too human. And the teeth, I saw the jaw, Dennis. Those weren't bear teeth. What happened to it?" "They brought in A helicopter lifted it out in a cargo net. We were told to amend our reports, reclassify it as a black bear. My supervisor tried to push back, asked for clarification on species identification. He was transferred to an office job in Spokane 2 months later. The second person was a SAR volunteer named Linda Chen, based out of the Mount Baker, Snoqualmie area. We talked over the phone in December 2018. She'd been on a search operation in 2004, looking for a missing hiker near the Nooksack River. We were working a grid pattern through old growth, she told me. 3 of us, together. We came across these structures, I don't know what else to call them. Stick formations, woven together, maybe 8 feet tall, arranged in a semicircle around a clearing. Structures like what? Like teepees, almost. But the construction was different, more deliberate. And the sticks were too large for humans to move easily. Some of them were 6, 7 inches in diameter, stripped of bark, positioned, upright and lashed together with what looked like twisted vine. Did you document it? We took photos, logged the coordinates. When we got back to base, our team leader showed the photos to a Forest Service ranger who happened to be coordinating with us. The ranger looked at them for maybe 10 seconds, then told us those were bear structures, that bears sometimes create formations like that when they're marking territory or searching for food. I almost laughed. That's not a thing bears do. I know, but that's what went into the report. Bear activity, natural formation, not relevant to the search. The photos disappeared from our database a week later. The third witness was the one that hit closest to home. Jerry Matsumoto, retired Forest Service, had worked in the North Cascades, my district, back in the early 2000s. We met at a diner in Marble Mount in February 2019. Jerry looked uncomfortable from the moment he sat down. He ordered coffee, didn't touch it, just stared at the... I've never talked about this, he said finally. Not even to my wife. You don't have to now. No, I do. Because if what I'm hearing about you is true about what you found in 2016, then you deserve to know you weren't the first. He described a night patrol in 2003. He'd been alone at a remote cabin, similar to Kevin's situation, when he heard vocalizations outside. Not animal sounds, something between a howl and speech, rhythmic and deliberate. He'd gone outside with his spotlight and caught a glimpse of something large moving through the trees, bipedal, massive. Gone before he could process what he was seeing. I radioed it in, Jerry said, described what I heard, what I saw. My supervisor told me to stay inside, that they'd send someone in the morning. But when morning came, nobody arrived. When I hiked out 2 days later, my supervisor pulled me aside and said I'd misidentified an elk, that the vocalizations were probably coyotes or owls. But you know what I know what I saw, and I know the look in my supervisor's eyes when he told me to forget it. He wasn't confused, Dennis. He was scared. All 3 stories followed the same pattern. Witnesses encountering evidence, reports being altered or suppressed, transfers, warnings, institutional pressure to recategorize reality into something acceptable. This wasn't just about what Kevin and Rita and I had found. This was systemic, coordinated, an apparatus that had been running for decades. I'm telling this story now because I'm 60 years old, retired, and I've run out of reasons to stay silent. Rita is gone. Kevin won't talk. The federal agents who arrived that morning in 2016 are probably still out there, still enforcing their protocols, but I'm past the point of caring what they can do to me. There are risks, of course. I've thought about them carefully. Legal repercussions are possible. What Kevin and I did that night, moving evidence, staging a scene, lying to federal agents, could be prosecuted as obstruction, tampering, maybe conspiracy. The statute of limitations on federal crimes is typically 5 years, but I don't know if that applies to whatever jurisdiction those agents operated under. They never identified their agency, never provided documentation. For all I know, they weren't bound by normal legal constraints. Then there's the credibility issue. I'm a retired ranger with no physical evidence except a tooth I gave to someone I won't name. I have photographs of tracks from 2018, but photographs prove nothing in an age of digital manipulation. The 3 witnesses I spoke with all requested anonymity. Tom, Linda, and Jerry were willing to share their stories with me privately, but none of them will go on record. They have families, pensions, lives they've built after leaving the Forest Service. I don't blame them. So what I'm left with is testimony. My word. my experience, my detailed account of what happened in September 2016. Some people will believe me. Many won't. I've made peace with that. What I haven't made peace with is what I've lost. My career ended that night, even if it took 3 more years for me to officially retire. The desk job in Wenatchee was exile, pure and simple, a message that I was no longer trusted in the field, no longer welcome in the culture I'd been part of for 2 decades. I went from active wilderness patrol to processing permit applications, from sleeping under stars to fluorescent lights and cubicle walls. My sense of purpose eroded more slowly. For years, I told myself the transfer was temporary, that I'd eventually return to real ranger work. But that possibility died a little more each month, each year, until I finally accepted that the career I'd built was over. I retired at 51, 9 years earlier than I'd planned, because staying meant continuing to live a lie. My faith in the institutions I served is gone entirely. I spent 23 years believing that the Forest Service, that federal land management, operated in the public interest with transparency and integrity. That belief didn't survive September 2016. Now I know there are parallel systems, shadow protocols, mechanisms designed specifically to hide truth rather than serve it. But I gained something too, though it took years to recognize it. I gained clarity about what matters. Not career advancement or institutional approval, but truth itself, the simple, stubborn refusal to pretend something didn't happen just because acknowledging it is inconvenient or dangerous. That clarity has a cost, but it also has value. I can look at myself in the mirror now without flinching. I gained connection to something larger than bureaucracy. That creature we found in the North Cascades was real, intelligent, and part of an ecosystem we barely understand. Knowing it existed, protecting its body from becoming another buried file that mattered in ways my daily ranger duties never did. And I gained a purpose for these final years. If this account reaches even a handful of people who are willing to consider that the wilderness holds more mysteries than science admits, if it encourages someone else with a suppressed story to speak up, then maybe the risks were worth it. The tooth is out there, with someone who may eventually be able to analyze it. The photographs from 2018 are backed up in multiple locations. This testimony will be recorded and preserved. None of it may be enough to prove anything definitively, but together they form a record that can't be easily erased. I don't expect vindication. I'm not looking for fame or validation or an apology from the federal government. I just want people to know what's out there in those mountains, what lengths certain agencies will go to keep it hidden, and what it cost 3 rangers who chose truth over silence on a cold September night. Some will call me a liar, others will call me crazy. I can live with both. What I couldn't live with was dying like Rita did, taking this story to the grave and leaving nothing behind but questions. The North Cascades are vast. When people hear that word, they think they understand it, but they don't. Not really. We're talking about nearly 700,000 acres of designated wilderness, and that's just the official boundaries. Add in the surrounding national forest lands, the remote areas of British Columbia just across the border, and you're looking at millions of acres of terrain that humans rarely penetrate. Old-growth forest where trees have stood for 500 years. Glacial valleys carved during the last ice age. Mountain passes that are snowbound 8 months out of the year. Creek drainages so thick with underbrush you can't see 10 feet in any direction. Caves, rock formations, hidden meadows that appear on no maps because no one has ever surveyed them. If you wanted to hide a species, something large, intelligent, elusive, this is where you do it. I've thought about this constantly over the past 8 years. If the creature we found in 2016 wasn't alone, if there's a breeding population up there, how many would there be? 100? 50? Maybe fewer. The territory could support a small population. There's food year-round if you know where to look, water everywhere, shelter in caves and dense forest. And if they're intelligent enough to avoid humans, to recognize our patterns and stay clear of our trails and cameras, they could persist indefinitely without detection. The tracks I found in 2018 suggest they're still there. Still moving through those mountains, still living in the spaces between human awareness. I think about that sometimes. How many hikers have walked within 100 yards of them and never known? How many rangers have heard vocalizations they dismissed as elk or wind? How many times has evidence been found and quietly suppressed? The question that haunts me most is about the shooting. Someone killed that creature. They fired too. shots, the first, probably a chest wound that would have been fatal given time, the second, an execution to make sure it stayed down. Then, they dragged it to that rock overhang and left it. Was it a hunter who panicked, thought they were shooting at a bear in the darkness and realized too late what they'd actually hit? Or did someone go into those mountains specifically to kill one, knowing exactly what they were hunting? I don't have answers. The federal agents never investigated the shooting itself, never searched for the person responsible. They came for the body, and when they couldn't find it, they left, which tells me the body was what mattered to them, the evidence, the proof, not justice for the killing. I wonder sometimes if the shooter knows what happened afterward, if they came back to check on their kill and found it gone, if they reported it to someone, or kept it secret like I kept mine. If they're out there right now, carrying the same weight I carry, the same knowledge that can't be unlearned. There are things I wish I'd done differently. I wish I'd taken more photographs that night before we moved the body, detailed shots of the face, the hands, the wounds. I wish I'd collected more tissue samples, hair, something beyond just that single tooth. I wish I'd been braver in 2018 when I found those tracks. Wish I'd made them public instead of keeping them to myself. But I did what I thought was right at the time, and I can't change it now. What I can do is offer a warning, though I know most people won't heed it. If you hike in the North Cascades, or any remote wilderness area where sightings have been reported over the years, pay attention. Not just to the obvious dangers, weather, terrain, animals you recognize, but to the things that feel wrong. Structures that shouldn't exist, vocalizations that don't match any known species, the feeling of being watched in places where you're supposed to be alone, and if you find evidence, tracks, hair, anything that suggests something unidentified, document it carefully. Multiple photographs from different angles, measurements, context. Then make copies and store them in multiple locations before you tell anyone official. Because if my experience is any indication, that evidence will disappear the moment the wrong people hear about it. Last fall, I drove up to the mountains one final time. I didn't hike in, my knees aren't what they used to be, and I'm past the age where I can safely cover that kind of terrain alone. Instead, I parked at a turnout along the North Cascades Highway and watched the sun set over the peaks. As darkness fell, I heard it. A sound from deep in the forest, low, resonant, deliberate. Not quite wood knocking. Not quite vocalization. Something in between. It echoed across the valley once, twice, then fell silent. I stood there listening for maybe 20 minutes, but it didn't repeat. Finally, I got back in my truck and drove away. I didn't investigate, didn't try to locate the source, didn't report it to anyone. I just listened, acknowledged what I'd heard, and left. Because some mysteries don't need to be solved. Some things are better left in the places they've survived for thousands of years, away from helicopters and federal agents and people like me who can't resist trying to prove they're real. The forest keeps its secrets, and maybe that's how it should be. But I wanted you to know, they're out there. I've seen the proof. I've carried the weight of that knowledge for 8 years, and now I've passed it on to you. What you do with it is your choice. My name is Dennis Halford. This is what happened in September 2016, and every word of it is true.